Hi folks, this week you're going to have a choice of whether you want to look at gender and education and technology, or if you want to look at age, seniors, older people, and technology. So I just wanted to give you a few statistics to kind of whet your appetite on both subjects. And let's start out by looking at boys in education. And it has become increasingly clear across the past decade, if not longer, that something is not working for boys in education. On the Reading National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is kind of the gold standard test, 35% of boys versus only 29% of girls scored below basic in reading in fourth grade, and the gap between the two that score below basic widens as you move to 8th grade and 12th grade. And also, although I didn't list it on here, the percentage of males that score at proficient or advanced is again significantly lower than that of girls. So reading being a basic foundation of education, you can see how this gap is imperiling boys, students, even in early elementary school. And we have some other evidence that boys aren't doing too well in K-12, and that is 1.86 million male versus only 776,000 female K-12 students were suspended in 2014. And in that same year, over 82,000 males versus only 28,000 females were expelled. Okay? And these differences that show up very early also show up when we look at ultimate educational attainment. And these data are all from 2017 from the National Center for Educational Statistics. And if you dig hard enough, you can find out almost anything there. So in 2017, only 1.3 million men versus 1.5 million women actually finished high school. So women are finishing high school at a somewhat higher rate. But then if you look at college enrollment, the difference gets even bigger. 61% of male high school graduates versus only almost 72% of female high school graduates enrolled in a 2 or 4 year college. And when we look at the results coming out the other end, the disparity is even greater. 42.9% of bachelor's degrees were earned by men in 2017, which means, of course, that 57.1% were earned by women. Only 40% and a little of master's degrees and 46.7% of doctorates were earned by men. And if you looked at these same figures 30 years ago, they would all be completely reversed, especially at higher levels of education. So the outcomes, both the inputs and the outcomes for boys in education are not doing well. And you will have the opportunity to read a number of possible articles talking about why that might be and what we could do about it. Okay, but it's not all roses in the garden for girls either, okay? Especially when we start looking at STEM. Boys still earn slightly higher NAEP scores in math and science at most levels in K-12. They're either exactly the same or boys are maybe 2 to 4 points higher, okay? However, when we get past the scores, when we start to look at outcomes and inputs, males and females are equally likely to take AP classes in high school, but only 19% of students in AP Computer Science were female in 2013, which is the most recent data I could get on that. Women earned only 19% of bachelor's degrees in engineering and 18% of those in computer science, even though, as you saw on the previous slide, they earn more bachelor degrees overall. When we move into the workforce, you see that same pattern. Although women constitute 47%, almost half, of the overall full-time workforce, they're only 28% of the workforce in science and engineering fields. And that disparity could be one of the reasons, but is not the entire reason, that still, in 2017, there's a huge gender pay gap. The average earnings for a man working full-time in 2017 were over $52,000, while on average, women working full-time earned only roughly $42,000, a $10,000, almost a 20% pay gap. So women are earning 80% of male earnings. And lest you think that this is because women are just taking less remunerative jobs, there's a link here. I'll post this whole thing to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it shows that in almost every occupational category, men are still out-earning women significantly. So something's not going too well for girls and women either. A lot of people will say that these differences are caused by innate gender differences. And the first article you're going to read looks at the scientific evidence for many supposedly innate gender differences. And it turns out that in fact there are some, but not quite so many as we would have guessed. And they're not all of nearly the magnitude we would have guessed either. So I think you'll find that article really interesting. Now, if we're going to look at why we're seeing these differences in gender outcomes, both in education and the workforce, there are four possible reasons, okay? One is genetic. Males have an XY chromosome, females have an XX. Lacking the Y chromosome is short. So because females have genes on the top of both of those X chromosomes, whereas males are lacking the top of that Y chromosome, males are more likely to have genetic issues linked to the genes on the top of that X chromosome. For example, men are much more likely to be hemophiliac. They're more likely to have almost all mental disorders, with the exception of depression, which is more likely to be diagnosed in females. And a lot of other health issues affect men much more often than they do women. There's also, of course, the question of hormone production in most men, which is why most men are taller and have broader shoulders and have a higher percentage of muscle and lose weight more easily, which I consider completely unfair. There's another cause of gender differences that we're just beginning to find out a lot about, especially due to research on homosexuality in both males and females, and that is prenatal exposure to hormones, which are generated typically in the womb, but sometimes aren't, can have enormous effects on gender effects on the body and the mind. So when you read that article, you're going to find out several of these. Of course, the other two explanations are not innate. They are a question of societal mores or just habits or what cultures believe is appropriate, which some people, of course, would call discrimination. But certainly we raise children differently, and also children learn different things as they grow up as boys or girls very often. So all of these things could be, probably are, causes of some of the differences we see both in education and in technology use and in outcome. One of the statistics I didn't put on the slides because I wasn't quite sure to whose advantage it was, but it is still true that a majority of gamers are boys, but it's not that many. The gaming industry estimates that 40 to 45% of game buyers and players are women, but they're very different kinds of games. Males are far more likely to play first-person shooters, but also far more likely to play elaborate strategy games like Red Alert, which is a very old game, I know, but Europa Universalis. Also, World of Warcraft still has more male players than female, whereas women are more likely than men to play phone games. So you see some differences in tech use there too. Okay, so I want to say something that's really important, and it will be reiterated in the first article that if you decide to look at gender, you will read. and that is all of these differences are not as big as the overlap. So here's just a sample distribution of a gender difference. And if the blue distribution, this is a bell curve, so this is like the number of people who are on either extreme and in the middle. Okay, so if the all people distribution is blue, it's and let's say that the red distribution is males and the purple distribution is females, you can see how if you look at the very peak of those distributions, that's the average, okay, of a normal distribution. The averages are different. But if you look at how much the curves overlap, that huge section in the middle there, there's much more overlap than there is difference. And we have to keep saying this. And the other thing that's very important to say about gender differences is that average gender differences should not and cannot be used to predict individual differences or to make them normative. So that, for example, just because one of the most strong and reliable differences between human males and females is that human males are taller, okay? On average, human males are significantly taller than human females. However, that doesn't mean that any one man is going to be taller than any one woman, as you well know. And it also does not mean that being tall is a necessary thing to be a man, or being short is a necessary thing to be appropriately female. So those caveats are very important when we start looking at gender differences. Okay, the statistics on age and technology and age discrimination, otherwise known as ageism, are much harder to come by because we've got boys and girls in schools and we can survey people, employers, about how many males and how many females they employ in certain things. But when you start getting into age discrimination, it's very difficult to figure out if an age difference in employment is due to discrimination, is due to who knows what. So this is what I was able to come up with recently. Of course, as you know, age discrimination for employees over 40 is prohibited by law and has been for, I think almost 30 years now. However, in 2017, when asked by the EEOC, I'm sorry, no, this was the AARP survey, 61% of people over 44 said they had seen or experienced age discrimination, and more women and minorities said this even than the 61%. It gets worse when we start looking at tech. 70% of all IT workers report having seen or experienced age discrimination, and over 43% at all ages said they were worried about losing their job due to age as they got older. And that was a different survey in 2015. Now, part of this is because, and what I'm going to have you look at more than the age discrimination in jobs, though I thought that was significant, is as people get older, especially when we get past my generation, the boomer generation, technology use kind of goes over a cliff. So that only 52%, only about half of the people over 73 in this country, according to the Pew Research Trust, use the internet, report using the internet at all for anything. Only 30% own a smartphone, and only 23% use social media. Well, as you and I both know, use of the internet is no longer an optional item. If you want to be able to find a good doctor, if you want to find a good used car, if you want to catch up with the news reliably instead of just what you see on the idiot box, the television, you've got to use the internet. Anytime you want to take control of your own destiny in this right now, in current times, you need the internet to do it with. Yet only half of those who are the oldest are using it. And they, ironically, have far more, especially medical and financial issues that they need to use. They need to use the internet to resolve. Likewise, we know that as people get older, there are major issues with staying in touch and staying connected to people. And yet only 73% have a smartphone, only 23% use social media. So if you elect to look at age and technology, we're going to look at primarily at what the advantages of technology could be for those who are older, and the advantages are enormous. And then what are some of the barriers that stop them, and how might we overcome those? So I think you'll enjoy either path you take, and have a great week.